What's wrong with Triple M? What is illegal here? Who is being defrauded here, Trevor?
It is about the best interest of the citizens of this country.
But the citizens are the ones who are playing, who are members or participants in this. If you put in 15,000 rand, after 12 months you get 1.2 million rands. I mean, who wouldn't go for this?
Watch Question Time with me, Mpho Tsedu, Monday to Thursday at 5:30 p.m. on the SABC News Channel.
Innovators all over Africa are using technology to solve the continent's problems.
We looked at all the different startup accelerators, and Hack Josie was born.
And governments are finding new ways to improve the lives of citizens.
We anticipate it will be in a position to handle a capacity of 20,000 logs per second.
On Network, we tell you about Africa's technology and social media scene. That's Network with me, Siphumelele Zondi, every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Central African Time.
The cotton field story is being told through patchwork by artists to celebrate the diaspora in America.
Vitally important in telling the stories of what is happening in the refugee crisis, with migration, with questions of immigration, and I believe I, as an artist, have a moral obligation to tell these stories.
It's through paper, brush and paint that the different faces of women are reflected by this prolific painter.
Women face a lot of challenges, discrimination, sexism, and a lot of other negative. In my paintings, I try to send a different message.
Place of the G-Men and Father Huddleston's mission. Place of Balanski's and the Odeon cinema, and let's never forget.
Join Refilwe for that 1 hour weekly dose of arts and entertainment news every Saturday at 12.
News Today keeps you informed with news locally and around the world.
When Judge John Hlophe challenged the Supreme Court of Appeal when it sent the matter back and said that there must be an inquiry set up.
We unpack business news.
There's an increase in general inflation in the country.
We give you up-to-date news of the day.
The drugs were seized at several locations in Sydney, including a shipping container sent from Hong Kong. Police say it's the largest haul of illicit drugs in 2 years.
We round up sports news.
Kotata, tell me about the legacy that you would like to build and be remembered for.
Trying to get my foundation running, which is going to focus on, all the sport, doesn't matter disability or able body. So, I'm passionate about sports.
Stay informed every Monday to Friday from 3 to 5:30 p.m. CAT. SABC News.
Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles legal issues, bring you information and analysis. My name is Dumilo Matez. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by tweeting us at Rights and Recourse or calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Alternatively, email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. The year 2016 has a particular significance for human rights in Africa. It marks the 35th anniversary of the adoption of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the 30th anniversary of its entry into enforcement, and the 10th anniversary of the establishment and operationalization of the African Court on Human Rights and People's Rights. Given the convergence of these auspicious milestones, the African Union Assembly meeting at its 25th ordinary session in June 2015 in Johannesburg, South Africa, declared 2016 as the African Year for Human Rights with particular focus on women. This declaration was greeted with optimism and celebration amongst human rights activists on the continent. Today on Rights and Recourse, we review the African Union's 27th Ordinary Summit in Kigali, Rwanda, especially from a human rights record and Africa's response to terrorism on the continent. We also hope that the African Union will consolidate the gains already made over the years and show a move towards the establishment of a true human rights culture on the continent. To help us navigate through the many challenges facing the continent are Musara Kimani, SABC's foreign correspondent, who is in Kigali, Rwanda. We would also like to welcome Mr. Dewa Mavinga, senior researcher from the Human Rights Watch. And lastly, we are joined by Japhet Bijon, Amnesty International's regional advocacy coordinator in Africa, who's joining us from Nairobi, Kenya on Skype. But first of all, probably let me start with you, Sarah. I don't know whether you are on the line, but let me start with you. Can you give us a brief overview of what has been happening at the Kigali summit since it started? Hello, Sarah, are you there? Well, let's try Sarah again. We'll go back to Sarah. But first of all, let me come back to the studio here with Dewa. Dewa, one of the most important things that a lot of people are looking forward to is there are so many challenges facing the African Union. One would expect that the South Sudan impasse is paramount and other issues too. Or are there other issues?
Absolutely. For Africa, there are several issues, but primarily to look at conflict and ensuring that there is justice on the continent, there is stability, there are areas that are flaring up, so you have mentioned South Sudan, but also Burundi has been burning for a while now. In Southern Africa, we have Mozambique, where there are clashes that are coming up that need to be looked at, and also there is the issue of terror. Boko Haram in Nigeria, and recently in South Africa we have had 4 cases of arrests related to terror, and these are the issues that the AU leaders need to look at to say how do they ensure peace.
We'll continue our discussion, but let's go back to Sarah in Kigali. Sarah, let's start with you. If you can give us an overview of what has been happening in Kigali since the summit started.
Yes, what happened today is that we are expecting the summit to open anytime from now. But earlier during the week, we have had closed-door meetings on South Sudan. We have had meetings on Burundi, one of the other areas in Africa that has had conflict. And leaders have also met on the sidelines to discuss infrastructure development, and also one of the agendas that they call Agenda 2063, which is a development agenda for the whole continent.
Well, the other question I want to know is what's happened around the issue of the election of a chairperson for the commission?
We are still waiting to know whether there's going to be an election for the chairperson of the African Union Commission to replace Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, because earlier we expected that the election would happen during these 2 days of the summit, that is either today or tomorrow. However, we understand that the regional bloc ECOWAS from the West African region has really been pushing that those elections are moved to January, saying that the 3 candidates who have put up their names to contest to succeed Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma are all not, have clout as the same as what Dr. Zuma has. In fact, we have been hearing that some are even suggesting that retired President Jakaya Kikwete of Tanzania should be considered for that post come January. So as of now, Rwanda is saying that the elections are going on, but we still do not know if indeed those elections will take place.
You say South Sudan was discussed. What has been agreed is going to happen in South Sudan now?
Well, the meeting yesterday, a closed-door meeting that lasted more than 5 hours between leaders of the East African region, South Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, and also the African Union High-Level Panel on South Sudan, together with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Now, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, was pushing for targeted sanctions against people or the leadership of South Sudan who are seen to perpetrate the violence. Like last week, left more than 200 people dead. We understand he was also pushing for an arms embargo, but South Sudan was able to vehemently reject the suggestions and the proposal for an arms embargo, and they were supported by Uganda, which is the guarantor to the August peace deal. And the argument is that an arms embargo at this time would leave South Sudan exposed and put it in more trouble than it already is. In terms of a peacekeeping force, having them, enforce and increase, Juba is refusing, and they're saying that already the country has enough foreign troops, and those are the ones that should be redistributed. They argue that it is not enough to just bring troops. Instead, it is how well you make use of them. And also they're saying that they're a sovereign country that doesn't need to be guarded by foreign troops. On sanctions, they say that the violence that happened last week was sporadic, was spontaneous. And so they're saying there is no need for targeted sanctions at this time, and they're saying that they are committed to a peace agreement that the war signed. But they're also saying that Dr. Riek Machar, the vice president, is no longer in Juba, and they're worried that as long as he's not in Juba, then it is difficult to continue with the peace agreement, and they fear that the country may return to war.
The other thing for me, today we celebrate International Day of Justice, and we heard the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Rwanda saying President al-Bashir is welcome in Kigali. Is he there?
Yes, indeed he's here, and he attended the meeting on South Sudan yesterday. He will be attending the opening ceremony, and also he has been taking part in all the sideline meetings. Rwanda said that they would not be put under pressure to arrest Bashir, saying that they are not signatories to the Rome Statute. And in fact, what Sudan has done is that it has put a spirited campaign against the International Criminal Court here. Yesterday they had a press conference where they brought in an official from ECOSOC who said that the International Criminal Court targets just African heads of state and has refused to target especially big nations which have been seen to commit war crimes in other countries. He pointed out to former Prime Minister Tony Blair of Britain and also former President George W. Bush, saying they committed crimes against humanity in Iraq, but they're still free and nothing has been done to them.
There's one more question I want to ask you. There has been talk that the summit was going to deliberate over what they call a critical development to ease free movement of people in Africa, the African Union passport. How will an African Union passport spur on economic growth and development? How far have you gone on this one?
The African heads of state will indeed be launching what they're calling an African e-passport. And the aim is to allow people to be able to get visas on arrival in any of the African countries without having to go through the rigorous process of applying for visas in the continent as it happens now. And what they're saying is if this happens, then trade between African countries will move from the current 11% to at least 50% by the end of 2018. And they hope that this will also force, the rural women or the market women and the informal traders who work along the borders of the countries to be able to freely cross into countries.
Sarah, let us allow you to go back to the summit, and because the plenary is starting of the heads of state, the opening ceremony. Sarah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah Kimani, our correspondent, who's normally based in Nairobi, Kenya, now covering the AU summit in Kigali, Rwanda. On the line from Nairobi, as we speak about Nairobi, we have Japhet Bijot. Japhet, somebody was saying to me, if you can hear me, somebody was saying to me the African Union was very ambitious in declaring 2016 the year of human rights. Or am I mistaken?
You are not mistaken for those who make the comment that the African Union was ambitious in declaring this year the year of human rights, because I think it is long overdue. Human rights has been an issue on the continent that ought to have been addressed a long time ago, but unfortunately there are serious human rights violations, serious human rights abuses that continue to occur on the continent. The recent conflict that has erupted again in South Sudan, and which Sarah has mentioned, is a grim reminder of the situation of human rights on the continent, and therefore it is up that they declared this year the year of human rights with a focus on women's rights. However, the African Union must move beyond declarations to taking concrete actions that must ensure that men and women, children, and other vulnerable groups on the continent are able to enjoy human rights in a meaningful way. So far, the African Union has focused so much on making declarations. You will remember that 13 years ago, the African Union ministers of justice and legal affairs met in Kigali And this time round, they are going back to Kigali. 13 years ago, they made a declaration concerning a number of issues, including that they are going to give human rights a prominent position within the African Union. That has not largely happened. It is time that they renew the commitment that they made 13 years ago back in Kigali, once again this time here when they meet in Kigali.
Well, thank you very much. We'll come back to you, Japheth, but as Japheth says there, his organization Amnesty International actually issued a very concise document that says from rhetoric to action, giving 27 recommendations to the 27th Summit of the African Union. We'll be back after the break, and we'll take your calls on 011 714 5497 5498. Alternatively, tweet us at Rights Recourse. Welcome back to Rights and Recourses to discuss the African Union Summit in Kigali, Rwanda, looking at what has transpired so far and what the ambition and aspirations of these great continents are. Dewa, one of the problems for me, I'm actually surprised that it would seem to me that the election of the chairman will be delayed.
Well, that's the challenge of the geopolitics on the continent. Behind closed doors, there are many things happening there. And this is one of the things that the African Union needs to overcome if it is to achieve the Agenda 2063 and to achieve unity within the continent. Because now what is happening is that we're looking at the dynamics of the so-called gravitas of the candidates who have been put forward and the likelihood that from complaints put forward by ECOWAS, the West Africa region, we're likely to have a pushback on these elections. So these are the challenges that we're facing, but there is need to look at ways of ensuring integration and unity within the continent.
Japheth, are you surprised with this move that the election of a chairman has been postponed?
I'm not entirely surprised. As you'll remember, and as already been mentioned, ECOWAS during their recent summit in June made a decision to ask the African Union to postpone the election. There has been a view amongst several countries that the candidates that have been put forward for the position of the chairperson are not of the caliber that they would wish to vote and that one of them becomes the chairperson. However, as already mentioned, the geopolitics of the continent sometimes have sacrificed merit on the altar of geopolitics, and you'll remember that a few years ago, at least a former president has served as a chairperson of the African Union Commission, and perhaps this is what has defined what the caliber of the chairperson of the African Union Commission should be.
Interesting. Sarah said earlier when we spoke to her that some people believe the former president of Tanzania, President Kikwete, should be the chairman of the commission.
Well, that's an interesting development, but if there are procedures and processes, regions had time to put forward their candidates, and Tanzania being in the SADC region, they had all stood behind the candidature of Botswana's Foreign Affairs Minister. So perhaps that's speculation, but certainly if there is an opening and extension of time, then perhaps President Kikwete will come forward.
The other question I asked Sarah was, there's talk of this African Union passport. and they are saying they do this so that there could be economic growth. My argument there is, how will an African Union passport spur economic growth and development? Because we have had people moving to other countries. We have over 1 million or over 5 million Zimbabweans staying here.
Absolutely. I think there is a challenge. I think it's a double-edged sword. What needs to be done is to look at a way of facilitating easier movement of people across the continent, but at the same time consider issues of stability and security, and also of equal growth in different regions, so that there is no one center that attracts everyone while others are in despair. So if you look at the SADC region, everyone is flocking to South Africa. There are problems in Zimbabwe. Mozambique has got its own clashes now, and people are fleeing to South Africa. So to ensure that there is integration and proper growth, there is need for SADC, for South Africa, and for the African Union to focus on ensuring stability in these hotspots, so that there is more or less equitable movement and trade internally. But without that, a passport alone would not achieve better trade.
Jaffet, intra-African trade we have not seen despite the formation of NEPAD, trade agreements has largely been negotiated with the European, Asian and North American blocs. We have seen recently Zimbabwe banning certain products from South Africa. Why should this African passport be the thing that's going to spur on trade?
I think one of the ways through which the African passport is going to steer trade is really ensuring the ease of movement. As you know, right now, moving across the continent
let me just get this. You say movement of goods and services.
Yes, movement of goods and services. It's currently difficult for many citizens of different countries to work and get work permits in neighboring countries or in other countries across the continent. And therefore, an African passport is going to make this much easier. But we must, however, remember that for the pilot phase of the e-passport or the African passport, this passport is only going to be available to heads of states and senior government officials and probably only ministers of foreign affairs. And therefore, it's going to take time before the concrete benefits and fruits of the African passport are to be realized and felt for the ordinary citizens of the continent.
Dewa, in her opening address during the start of the conference, Dr. Nkosazana Zuma, the chairperson of the commission, speaks about the creation of a balance between national, continental common good. Why do I get the impression that the member states are concerned about their own programs rather than those of the continent?
Well, naturally, that's the move, and it's a paradox, really, that when you have nations being isolationist in their approach and policies to look at their own internal growth. And this has happened, you rightly mentioned Zimbabwe, which has banned imports from South Africa when they are talking of integration at the continental level. And it's replicated in other cases where the balance is in favor of domestic interests ahead of continental integration, because there is a sense that countries do not get benefits from being part of the AU. So you would find that even in terms of trade, countries would rather negotiate bilaterally and not within the framework of the African Union. And this is the challenge for the AU leadership, that it's largely talk and rhetoric at the level of the AU, but less of action.
Let's take this call from James from Cape Town. James, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Yes, Mr. Mateza. All I wanted to say is in Africa we have a big challenge because we are hiding too much behind diplomacy and sovereignty of every country. So if AU as an organization, it's failing to really move into any country which has got any problems, though it's also the continent of moving forward with all the programs which they lay on the table. So we have got a lot of talk, but less action because of this sovereignty of a country and the diplomacy. It's going to take years and years. And African passport, I don't think it will work because our economies, they are not even and they are not the same. So it's going to be a one-way traffic to a region or a country which has got better opportunities, because the African Union is not really talking about all these things. So destabilizing the other country is also creating other problems in the other regions, but there's no one talking about it.
Thank you very much, James. We'll go back to James when we come back from the break. I just want to finalize when we come back from the break the issue of the candidates that we are told do not have the same gravitas as Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, and look at their backgrounds probably before we go further into our program. If you'd like to join us and do as James has done, join our discussion, please call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Alternatively, tweet us at Recourse. Stay with us.
Usisiwe Jamsana, SABC News, Alice.
Mzondi Lembeje, SABC News, Doha, Qatar.
Kunatibingo SABC News, Alice.
Diabo Seto, SABC News, Geneva, Switzerland.
Nampumelo Siziba, SABC News, Moscow, Russia.
Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Craig Murray, SABC News, Stellenbosch.
We bring the news back home. We keep the nation fully informed.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse. You are still watching our program where we discuss the AU summit that is taking place in Kigali in Rwanda. Japheth, let me come back to you. What James was saying, James is in a sense saying that the AU is no different from the OAU.
In terms of rhetoric, one would say that the AU is no different with the OAU. But I think we must admit that there's been significant improvements from the OAU to the AU. And particularly in terms of the structure now of the African Union Commission with the leadership and the different portfolios, I think there's been significant improvements. On the side of human rights, the African Union has given much more prominence to human rights than the Organization of African Unity. Actually, as you know, the Organization of African Unity, the principles of state sovereignty and non-interference with domestic affairs was so embedded within the OAU such that the organization was unable to deal or address human rights issues on the continent. Things have significantly have somehow changed with the creation of the African Union, but we are not yet there. There are still several challenges, and that's why Amnesty International, for instance, has made 7 recommendations that will if implemented, will see the organization starting to move from just rhetoric to really concrete actions that will ensure that human rights is respected and a culture that respects and observes human rights is created on the continent.
Dewa, I wanted to, before we went to the break, I said I just want us to have a look at the candidates. The 4 candidates were there. Agabita Mbamukui from Equatorial Guinea, from a Spanish-speaking country. Dr. Speciosa Nainganga Wandira Kazibwe, former vice president and also a minister in several other portfolios in Uganda. Dr. Pilenomi Vincent Mutoi, a journalist, former journalist and a foreign minister of Botswana, and Professor Abdoulaye Bathily from Senegal. How do you say these people do not have the gravity of what to make a chairman of the AU? For instance, Mbamukoi was working for the UN, for goodness sake.
Absolutely. That's where you see that when you talk of gravitas, it might really be more to do with the politics behind the scenes, which we may not be privy to, but in reality, these candidates, any of the 4, would be in a position to adequately discharge the mandate of the African Union chairperson. So what we need to look at is what are the geopolitics and what's the jostling behind the scenes and the trade-offs that are happening.
There is a belief, Japhet, that the African Union and its relevant organs should take urgent steps to ensure human rights protection is at the center of conflict prevention, and the response must prompt that there should be. It's what we're talking about in Sudan, South Sudan. The AU has to move very quickly. I think this is one of the recommendations I took from your recommendations that you say the African Union should be doing.
Yes, one of the recommendations we make is that the African Union should take urgent steps to ensure that human rights protection is at the center of conflict prevention and its response. We make this recommendation because when you look at the history of the African Union, and especially after the establishment of the Peace and Security Council in 2004, human rights has played a peripheral role in its response to conflict and resolution. It's only in the last 2 or so years that we have seen human rights starting to play some role when the African Union responds to conflict. For instance, in South Sudan, they established a commission of inquiry on South Sudan, which was specifically established to look into human rights violations and abuses. However, when the commission of inquiry issued its report, it took the African Union and the Peace and Security Council in particular about 1 year before it could consider and adopt the recommendations of that commission of inquiry. The same applies to other countries like Nigeria, where we know that Boko Haram has meted out violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law. But if you look at the way the African Union has dealt with the situation in northeastern Nigeria, it has always condemned only the violations committed by Boko Haram. However, we know and we have documented serious human rights violations that have been committed by Nigerian military forces. And therefore you see that while the African Union focuses on only one side of the abuses and violations, it fails to focus on the other side of abuses and violations. And that's why we are recommending that at the center of any conflict response by African Union, human rights must play a much more important role than it is currently happening.
Talk about human rights there. Why would the African Union try and separate human rights and women's rights? In our view, as human rights activists, women's rights are human rights.
Absolutely, and this is where the African Union needs to bring these two together and say women's rights are indeed human rights. And when you look at conflicts that are happening across Africa, the most affected are women. When men flee or go on to fight, women and children remain behind, and they carry the brunt of the violence and the disputes. So really there is need to put front and center the rights of women and children on the continent, not only in terms of declarations, but in terms of practical steps that need to be taken to ensure their protection.
It is with dealing with the crises that are on the continent when you are to deal with these kind of rights, women rights and children rights.
Yes, but also beyond that, you are looking at the face of poverty on the continent, which is really, again, women and children. And there are other issues that may be there, for example, around child marriage, for example. That's one of the big issues that the AU is championing, to end child marriage, because when you talk of child marriage, many rights are violated in that process of marrying off children, girls, before they get to the age of 18. They are deprived of their right to education, deprived of their right to health, and they get into usually a lot of domestic violence. So that also is another area that needs focus by the AU.
Japhet, many people, critics of the African continent, normally talk about the African Union is very slow to respond to the crises in Africa. It was very slow to respond to the Ebola virus. It was very slow to respond to the Libyan problem. It did not think it was affected by the Arab Spring when it erupted in Tunisia, and also with regard to Boko Haram. How do we then, as citizens of this great continent, ask of our leaders to move with speed to solve these problems?
It is true that the African Union has always moved very slowly. For instance, if we just consider the violence that has erupted in South Sudan, the United Nations Security Council was first to hold an emergency meeting. A day or two after, that's when the Peace and Security Council held its meeting on the same violence. So, to some extent, it's true that the African Union is quite slow in its response to conflict situations. What needs to be done is to separate politics from response to human rights issues and to conflict situations on the continent. Many times you find that politics get in the way of the African Union's response to these conflicts. Bureaucracy gets into the way of the African Union's African Union's response to conflict and human rights violations. And therefore, if these two issues are to be sorted out, then the African Union may start to move much more quickly, and especially if it has the political will to deal and address conflict and human rights violations.
Well, yes, if you want to join us, you can still call us on 011-714-5497 or 5498. Alternatively, you can tweet us at Rights Recourse. You can also email your thoughts about this program and many others at the SABC to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. We'll be back after the break.
Did you go to heaven?
Kelvin is the one who created all this.
What are you fighting over? Us?
If there is 10 million in my account, it will be in the front page the next day.
Do you have 10 million?
Oh, Jesus, hold my hand. Hallelujah.
It's happening right here on Question Time today.
Monday to Thursday at 5:30 p.m. on the SABC News Channel.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse to discuss the African Union Summit that is taking place in Kigali, Rwanda. The question I wanted to ask, probably I should start with you, Dewa. There has been an influx of immigrants from Africa into Europe. The majority, of course, are dying in the Mediterranean. What is the plan of action from the AU's point of view to stem the tide of people leaving our shores for greener pastures because our economies are stagnant and human rights are trampled?
I do not believe that there has been a comprehensive plan by the African Union or even focus or prioritization of this huge challenge that is there, because many people, thousands are dying trying to cross the Mediterranean onto Europe. But what needs to be the focus, as has been said previously, is to say how do we ensure that Africa itself has got sufficient resources, develops, and has the kind of stability that retains its citizens. Because what you have are people who are fleeing political, economic, and social challenges and conflict. So the focus should be on taking away those push factors, the conflict and the rapid response when you have conflict in Africa without politicization. Because now you see that sometimes, because of the politics, there is a reluctance to act decisively and quickly to take away the challenges that continue in Africa. So if we are to have an Africa that respects human rights, that has good governance, that has good development indicators, all these things would then make it possible that people would not find it necessary to risk their lives, cross the oceans to go to Europe.
Jeffet, African leaders have had a tendency when this whole thing started, this migration thing started, saying it is a problem of Europe. Is it a problem of Europe, or is it our problem first?
It's first our problem, because there are push factors that are making African citizens from several countries, Eritrea, Nigeria, Sudan, to seek to migrate from Africa to Europe. And therefore, unless these push factors are addressed, unless the serious human rights violations, for instance, in Eritrea, that are making Eritreans risk the flight from through the ocean from Libya to Europe is addressed, then it will remain a problem that the African Union and African continent will need to address. It is largely an African problem rather than a European problem where people are seeking to fly to.
On that, Japhet, you also say in your recommendations to the African Union Summit that African member states should push for a new global system of responsibility sharing for refugees, especially from the African Union member states.
Yes. As you know, the refugee problem has become a global crisis. And there have been several proposals, especially from European countries, on sharing of refugees. And therefore, Amnesty International is recommending a new mechanisms of responsibility sharing amongst countries in the world. And the proposal that we are making and which we are urging the African Union to support is that responsibility sharing should be based on an objective criteria. It should, for instance, be based on the GDP or the GNI of a country. It should be based on the number of refugees that a country has already has when it's receiving other refugees. It should be based also on the unemployment rates within a specific country. And therefore, using this objective criteria, refugees should be shared across all the countries of the world, regardless of whether they are neighbors to these countries where the refugees are sourced from or not.
There were in 1969, the OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems of Africa and the Kampala Convention for the protection and assistance of internally displaced persons. Apparently, some 9 member states are yet to ratify the OAU Refugee Convention. Is this what you refer to as a moving away from rhetoric and going to action?
That's part of the challenge, that you see there is a reluctance by member states to fully embrace the legal framework that is there to protect refugees and in some cases internally displaced persons. But beyond that, there is leeway for countries within their own borders to have additional laws that relate to the rights of refugees. So there again, there is need to ensure that there is adequate protection of refugees, and that really there is also additionally focus on the push factors where the countries that are giving rise to the refugees to flee into other countries. So for instance, if you're looking at Southern Africa, South Africa, being the main recipient of refugees from the region, needs to focus not only on mechanisms to protect refugees in South Africa, but also on mechanisms to ensure that the instability that is triggering the influx of refugees is addressed in the neighboring countries like Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and other places.
Japhet, you wanted to say something around that too?
Yes, I wanted to say, the fact that 9 countries, Djibouti, Eritrea, Madagascar, Mauritius, Namibia, and Sao Tome and Principe, Somalia and South Sudan have not ratified the OAU 1969 Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems is one of the reflections of the failure of African states to actually take concrete actions to address the question of refugees. But as already been mentioned, it is not sufficient just to ratify these treaties. The treaties must be translated into domestic law, and after translating them into domestic law, they must actually be implemented in actual practice. And that is the only way that the problem is going to be addressed, and that refugees are going to have their rights respected and observed.
Let us take this call from Musa from Johannesburg. Musa, good afternoon and welcome to Rise and Recourse.
Good day to you. How are you?
Oh, thanks. How are you?
Good. Yeah, my contribution, I will start on by saying what we are faced with now is because the same continent, the motherland, has not done anything to make conflict resolution a very public subjects like civic education to start with. Because should conflict resolution be taken as a serious civic education subject in all African countries, conflict will be at a civilized level at this stage. As it is, we found ourselves a living testimony of the old great trek, which has been the Africanist of nomadic all the time. Now it's no longer seasonal. But if conflict can be addressed, this generation at a very early level, especially with sports, will have few conflicts as we are becoming a generation to move on.
Thank you, Muso. Muso says there must be conflict, there must be education, conflict resolution. But in answering that question, both of you, let me start with you, Dewa. What is Agenda 2063?
Well, Agenda 2063 is the agenda of the African Union, which has aspirations to say by 2063, Africa should have achieved a certain level of embracing democratization, good governance, human rights respect, development objectives in terms of elimination or eradication of poverty, eradication of, conflict. Really, guns must be silent by 2020, for instance. So it's quite an ambitious agenda, which, as we are in 2016, it does not appear that there are clear steps that are being taken to go towards that agenda because of the politics, because of the leadership that is focusing not so much on embracing the continent, but mainly on their domestic issues. But on paper, it is a very good document. My fear is that we might get to 2063 when no one really remembers what it was all about. So that's my concern.
What is your view, Japhet?
Yes, I agree completely with Dewa that on paper, Agenda 2063 of the African Union is a very good document that sets out the aspirations of the continent and the issues that it would like to see, the image of the continent that it would love to see by 2063. However, what lacks currently as Dewa has mentioned, the lack of concrete steps that have been taken to ensure that we reach there by 2063. For instance, as already mentioned, the agenda foresees that by 2020 we shall see that the guns are silent across the continent, that there will be no armed conflict on the continent. But there is very little that is being done. Instead, we are seeing renewal of conflicts. We are seeing old conflicts continuing, and there is no concrete action that has been taken to end this conflict. Secondly, also is a question of ownership. I think the African Union has developed the Agenda 2063 without the active participation of African citizens. There are very few African citizens that know about the agenda, leave alone about the nitty-gritty details that are contained in the agenda. So there is urgent need to ensure that the agenda is well disseminated and that Africans are able to own and embrace the agenda.
I want to go back, Dewa, to the women issue. Apparently there was a Maputo protocol that was signed and agreed on by the AU, which states that every woman has a right to recognition and protection of her human and legal rights, which includes equality in marriage. I've never seen that. Access to justice and political participation. Until the most vulnerable people are protected, this will remain a dream.
Yes, indeed. And in that regard, the issues of gender equality in the Maputo Protocol, in both public and private institutions, there is a long way that needs to be traveled to achieve it. But we need to acknowledge that there have been some steps, particularly around ending child marriage. The SADC Parliamentary Forum has adopted a model law that sets 18 as the minimum age for marriage. And so there are some small steps that need to be complemented. What needs to happen is to ensure that we do not go backwards in terms of ensuring gender equality and adherence to the Maputo Protocol.
Well, as we are told, we are now going to close the program early, for we apologize for that. We've got to cross to Kigali, where the opening ceremony of the summit is taking place with Sarah Kimani and Sophie Mukwena. And from us, all of you, we are thanking to our guests, and to all of you from here in the studio, we say goodbye.